On the 20th of December 2022, a group of engineers stood in a control room buried inside a mountainside above the Jinsha River in southwest China. On the wall in front of them, 16 panels glowed in a long row. For a long time, one of those panels had stayed dark. That morning, the last panel lit up. Somewhere deep below their feet, inside a machine as tall as a building, a spinning shaft that weighed more than 2,000 tons began to turn for the first time. Nobody cheered. Nobody clapped. The people in that room were tired, and they had been tired for years. They just watched a number climb on a screen, the way people watch a pot come to a boil. A river that had been roaring through this canyon for millions of years now did most of its roaring through steel. What if the most important machine on Earth is one that almost nobody will ever visit? What if the thing that quietly decides whether whole cities stay lit at night is a single wall of concrete in a canyon so remote that most of the country has never seen a photo of it? Here is a number to hold on to. This dam makes roughly 62 billion kilowatt hours of electricity every single year. A kilowatt hour is the energy it takes to run a typical household for about an hour. 62 billion of those every year is enough to cover the daily power needs of something like 150 million people. And here's the strange part. Put the coal ledger next to that number and it gets even heavier. The electricity this one dam sends out each year equals saving more than 19 million tons of standard coal, the benchmark fuel the country's power statistics are measured against. By the end of October 2023, less than a year after the last unit started, the station had pushed its first 100 billion kilowatt hours east, roughly 30 million tons of coal that never had to be dug, shipped, or burned. This is only the second biggest power station of its kind in China. There is one even larger, sitting further downstream on the same river system. To understand why anyone would pour this much concrete into a canyon, you have to go back and watch China stumble into its own success. For 30 years, the country grew faster than almost any place on Earth. Millions of people moved into cities. Factories multiplied. Every lamp, every motor, every machine wanted power. And for most of that time, the fuel that answered the call was coal. Coal was cheap and it was everywhere. But coal is also heavy, and moving it costs almost as much as burning it. Day and night, freight trains loaded with black rock crawled across the country from the mines in the north and the west to the power plants near the cities in the east. Each of those trains was a line of dependence. If the rails jammed, if a storm shut a mine, if the price of coal jumped, the lights in entire provinces started to flicker. And the smoke. The coal smoke hung over the river valleys and sat on the rooftops of the big cities. People born in the 1990s grew up with a sky that was often gray at noon. The air tasted wrong in winter. Doctors started writing about a new normal. It was not just a problem of money. It was a problem of breathing, and it could not be solved by burning more of the same rock. So the country turned to water. This was not a new idea. Rivers had turned wheels for China for thousands of years. But the scale of the new idea was different because the geography of China set up a strange puzzle. The rivers with the most power, the steepest drops, the wildest flow, run through the deep canyons of the far west, in places where almost nobody lives. The cities that need the power the most, the factories that need it around the clock, sit 2,000 kilometers away in the east, on the flat, crowded coastal plains. That distance is the whole story. The energy is in one place. The hunger is in another. Whatever China built to solve this had to do two impossible things at once. It had to capture a wild river, and it had to send the result of that capture across half a continent without losing it on the way. The dam was only half of the answer. The other half is a wire that had to be invented. Now, the wall itself. Look at a photo of Baihetan from the air and your eye will do a double take. Ordinary dams look like mountains of earth and rock, fat and heavy, leaning against the valley. Baihetan does not look like that. It looks thin, almost delicate. A giant white blade of concrete curved across the river like a smile. It stands 289 meters tall, nearly as high as a 100-story building, and yet from the side, it looks thin enough to be a mistake. How does something so thin hold back a lake? Here's the trick, and it is a lovely one. The dam is curved, and a curved wall does not just hold water, it pushes sideways. Picture a playground slide arched across a river. When the water shoves against the curve does not fight the water alone. It passes the shove along its own body into the canyon walls on either side, which are solid rock 1,000 meters deep. The dam is a bridge that hands the weight of the whole lake to the mountain. Take away the canyon, and the dam would fold like paper. Keep the canyon, and the dam becomes a shell that can stand for centuries. It is the same trick an egg uses. An egg is paper thin, but it cannot be crushed by a hand squeezing around it, because the load spreads around the whole curve. Building that curve was its own war with physics. Concrete does something strange when it hardens. The chemical reaction inside it gives off heat. A lot of heat, and a big block of hot concrete cracks as it cools, the way a hot glass dish cracks when you run cold water over it. Early dam builders learned this the hard way. Whole walls turned into spider webs of fractures. The engineers at Baihetan beat the heat by being patient. They invented a special low-heat concrete mixed from the local rock, and they did not pour the dam in one giant slab. They built it in layers, one block at a time, like stacking books, over years. And inside every fresh layer, they buried a web of metal pipes carrying ice-cold water. As the concrete sweated heat, the pipes drank it away, the way you press a cold pack against a fevered forehead. Keep that image, because it runs deeper than it looks. The concrete on this job had to last a century, and it had to do it while holding back a lake and shaking in earthquakes. The site sits in a region the designers rate at seismic intensity level 8, which is a scientist's way of saying the ground here can move hard. The curve of the dam, the same egg trick that spreads water pressure, also spreads earthquake shaking across the whole structure, so no single spot takes the hit alone. Down in the machine hall, the real monsters live. The station hides 16 power units, and every single one is the largest of its kind that has ever been built. Each unit can put out 1 million kilowatts. 1 million. That is roughly the power need of 1 million homes at once, and there are 16 of them lined up in a cavern the size of a shopping mall, all turning at once. To say 1 million kilowatts is to say a gigawatt, a number big enough to stop meaning anything. So put it in human terms. One unit, running flat out, could carry the whole load of a good-sized city, every home, every hospital bed, every streetlight, everything. The station can run 16 of them at once, which is why its name shows up in Chinese textbooks as one number, 16,000 megawatts. Think of each unit as a giant fan running in reverse. The lake above the dam holds enormous pressure. That pressure pushes water through tunnels in the rock and into the unit's runner, a wheel with 15 blades, each blade weighing about 12 tons, the whole wheel about 9 meters across, like a ship's propeller for a ship that never sails. Manufacturing those runners was a world-first puzzle of its own. Each wheel was balanced almost perfectly by itself, with no added counterweights to fix the wobble, the first time any giant runner had ever achieved that. The crews worked to a standard so fine that a wheel of about 340 tons, the weight of 8 battle tanks, spins without a tremor. The first 1 million kilowatt runner was finished at a plant run by Dongfang Electric in January of 2019, years before the canyon was ready to receive it. The water slams into the blades turn the shaft, and the shaft turns a rotor, a spinning drum of magnets weighing more than 2,000 tons, spinning between coils of wire. This is the oldest trick in electricity, the same one a bicycle dynamo uses, just blown up to the size of a building. Move a magnet past a wire and the wire fills with current. Here, the falling river is the pedaling, and the current that pours out of the coils is the whole point. Water goes in at the top of the mountain. Electrons come out at the bottom, 200 meters below, ready to travel. The precision of the assembly hurts to think about. Parts that weigh as much as a fully loaded train carriage have to fit together with gaps no thicker than a human hair. A single bad weld in a unit that size would be a catastrophe, so the welds were practiced on full-size copies first, in a hall far from the river until the crews could make perfect joints in their sleep. The Chinese engineers who oversaw this have a joke they tell visitors. Putting these machines together, they say, is like trying to put a screen protector on your phone if your phone weighed 8,000 tons and you could not use your hands. Now for the second half of the trick, the part nobody photographs. Electricity is shy, it leaks. Push it down an ordinary power line for 2,000 kilometers and most of it never arrives because the wire quietly eats it as heat along the way. The only way to send power that far without losing it is to make it travel at a voltage so high it barely makes sense. High voltage is to electricity what a narrow hose nozzle is to water. Squeeze the same flow into a harder stream and it travels further before falling apart. That is why, above the canyon and across half of China, the engineers built something the world had never seen at this scale. Towers, taller than a 30-story building, marching over mountains and across rivers for more than 2,000 kilometers, carrying not one wire but two, each under a pressure of 800,000 volts. That is thousands of times the voltage inside your kitchen wall. Even the air around those lines hums and crackles with the strain. Birds learn to avoid them. Rain does not fall on them so much as steam off them. 2 of these giant lines leave the canyon. One runs east to the province of Jiangsu, a line stretching about 2,080 kilometers, switched on in July of 2022. The other runs to Zhejiang, opened on the 30th of December that same year. Each one can carry 8 million kilowatts, a gigawatt current that would be enough to run a mid-sized country all by itself. Further east, the line had to cross the Yangtze itself. They raised 2 towers 385 meters tall, the tallest power towers ever built on Earth. Thin steel skeletons that look from the riverbank like needles stuck into the mud. Ships pass under the wires at their feet, and the wires carry 800,000 volts across a span wide enough to swallow a skyscraper whole. And together, they do what no dam alone could do. They make the river power, Shanghai's washing machines and Shenzhen's server rooms, 2,000 kilometers from the nearest drop of falling water. Think about what the East does with that power. Jiangsu and Zhejiang are two of the most crowded, most industrial corners of the country. Factory lines that never stop, harbor cranes working through the night, highway interchanges glowing under towers of light, server farms that cannot afford a flicker. All of them drink electricity by the gigawatt. The river sends what the coast needs, and the coast needs almost everything the river has. Before you dismiss that as background detail, sit with it for a second. Think of the last time you plugged something in at night. The charger in your pocket, the lamp beside your bed, the hum of the fridge in the dark kitchen. What if the electricity in that moment had fallen down a cliff in a canyon you have never seen, 2,000 kilometers away from your hand? What would it change about how you think about a river to know that a river you will never visit is the reason your room never goes dark? Hold that thought. The strangest part is that Baihetan is not even alone. It is the newest link in a chain that turns an entire river into one single machine. Start at the top of the chain and work down. Wudongde, just over 10,000 megawatts. Baihetan, 16,000. Ziluodu, nearly 14,000. Zhangjiaba, about 7,800. Then the Old King, the Three Gorges, 22,500 megawatts from 34 units. And finally, Gajuba, the veteran of the 1980s. 6 dams, 1 river, 1,800 kilometers of linked reservoirs, a combined strength of about 72,000 megawatts, pouring out roughly 300 billion kilowatt hours a year. Count the machines. Between them, the 6 stations run 110 generating units, more giant turbines than most countries own in total. Run together, they act less like 6 separate dams and more like one long power plant wrapped around a single river. Think of it as 6 batteries wired in series on the same cable. When the East wakes up and pulls power, the river stations do not all run at full blast. They talk to each other. The control centers pass the demand up the chain like a message passed along a line of people. If one reservoir is high, it runs harder. If another is low and the river needs to rebuild its water behind the dam, the others cover for it. On a rainy day in one valley and a clear day in the next, the water is spent where it is needed, not where it falls. A river that used to run wild now runs on a schedule, tuned to the moods of a whole country. To understand what it took to build just one of those links, go back to the summer of 2017, when the first work crews arrived at Baihetan. The site was a canyon so deep that sunlight reached the bottom for only a few hours a day in winter. The towns on the 2 banks, Ningnan on one side and Qiaojie on the other, were small, poor, and separated by a river that could not be crossed quickly. There were no roads worth the name. Everything, every ton of steel, every machine, every bag of cement, every meal for every worker, had to come down the cliffs or up the river. For 5 years, the canyon became a city that never slept. Crews worked in shifts around the clock under floodlights that turned night into a pale orange day. They cut 2 huge caverns out of the rock for the machine hall, a space large enough to hold a football field, end to end. Then they filled it with machines whose parts had been hauled in piece by piece. The first generators began turning on the 28th of June 2021. The last one, the 16th, came alive on the 20th of December 2022, and 13 years of work, on and off, finally closed out. 13 years. A child born when the surveys started could have learned to drive by the day the lights came on. The dam itself is a monument of patience measured in concrete. In total, the wall swallowed about 8 million cubic meters of low-heat concrete, poured block by block over years, enough to fill thousands of full-size swimming pools. The crest, the road along the top, runs 709 meters from one canyon wall to the other, and standing on it feels like standing on the edge of the sky. Those 13 years left a mark on the people who lived them. Engineers who spent their youth in the canyon came out gray-haired. The site had its own hospitals, its own canteens, its own little streets carved into the mountainside. And when the river finally rose behind the closed gates, it swallowed the old riverbank paths, the fishing spots, the ferry crossings, everything that had been there for 1,000 years. A lake stretched far upstream where a roaring river used to be. On a map, the change looks like nothing. On the ground, it is the difference between 2 entirely different landscapes. So here's the part where we stop and be honest, because a story that only cheers gets boring, and a skeptic deserves a proper hearing. Dams like this one have real, heavy costs, and the people who pay them are not always the people who see the benefits. Start with the river itself. The lake behind the wall is calm, but calm water is not the same as healthy water. The river used to carry silt, the fine mud that feeds floodplains and rebuilds riverbanks downstream. The dam catches most of that silt and stores it behind the wall forever. Over the decades, that changes the river below. Scientists who study the Jinsha have documented what dams do to fish, too. The migration paths that fish have followed since long before humans arrived are now blocked by walls of concrete, and the slow water lakes that replace fast rivers suit some creatures, but not others. Then there are the people. The reservoir where the lake now sits was farmland and towns before it was water. By the counts of researchers who followed the project, more than 100,000 people were moved out of the flooded zone, their homes dismantled and rebuilt elsewhere, their villages erased under the new lake. China's dam builders say the compensation was fair and the new towns are better than the old ones. Not everyone who was moved would agree, and no number of kilowatt hours can fully answer a person who lost the ground their family stood on for generations. Even the ground itself is part of the doubt. The canyon sits in a region rated at seismic intensity level 8, and big dams hold lakes that weigh like small seas. The engineers answer that the curved wall spreads earthquake shaking the way it spreads water pressure, and they point to 70 years of data from arch dams around the world. They are not lying. But an honest skeptic can still ask a question that has no clean answer. What does it mean to trust a machine this size to hold forever, in a country that has known real earthquakes with the power to fold a city? The dam was built to take the strongest shaking that the canyon's geology says is possible. Beyond that, there's only physics and hope, the same pair that every dam in history has leaned on. And there is one more cost that rarely makes the news, because it is slow. A dam does not stop a river. It delays it. The flood that would have come down the canyon in a single angry week now comes as a longer, gentler release, managed valve by valve. That is the point of the machine, of course. But it also means the river no longer does the work it used to do for free, reshaping its own banks, flushing its own bed, telling the land when it is time to flood and when it is time to dry. Somewhere downriver, farmland that used to be renewed by the river's silt is a little poorer for the lack of it. That cost does not show up on any power bill. It shows up slowly, over decades, in the quiet decline of things nobody thinks to measure. The honest answer to all of this is not that the skeptic is wrong. The skeptic is right, and the engineers would be the first to admit it, in private. The real answer is that the choice was never between a dam and a perfect river. It was between a dam and a coal plant, and both of them eat something that can never be given back. The coal plant eats the air everyone breathes. The dam eats a stretch of river and a stretch of local memory. Given only those two doors, most countries choose coal because it is cheap to start and the bill comes due later, from the sky. China, for better and worse, chose the river and paid the bill up front in the only currency the canyon accepted, the ground itself. Now step back from the canyon and look at the map of the whole country, because Baihetan is not the destination. It is a rehearsal. On the 25th of December 2024, China approved the largest hydropower project ever drawn. It will sit on the Yarlung Zangbo River, the wild water that becomes the Brahmaputra when it crosses into India. And it is being built in a place where the river carves through one of the deepest gorges on Earth, dropping so steeply that engineers describe the stretch as a staircase built by nature. The project is planned at a capacity above 60,000 megawatts, with an estimated yearly output near 300 billion kilowatt hours. That is roughly 3 times what the Three Gorges produces, the dam that was, until now, the biggest on the planet. The price tag tells you who is doing this and how serious they are. The investment is expected to pass 1 trillion yuan, which is more than $130 billion, on a single construction site, in a gorge so deep and remote that the first task is not building the dam, but building the roads and tunnels to reach the spot where the dam will someday stand. Nobody builds something like that for a slogan. They build it because they believe the electricity is already sold, 10 and 20 years before the first unit turns. Now, before the celebration, you will hear the doubts, and they deserve the same honesty we gave the canyon. The Yarlung Zangbo becomes the Brahmaputra in India, and the Brahmaputra feeds farms and cities and a delta in Bangladesh that is home to tens of millions of people. What happens to a river upstream is never just an upstream question. Indian scientists and analysts have already raised their concerns out loud. Changes in the flow, changes in the silt that fertilizes the floodplains, the risk that a flood upstream becomes a different kind of flood downstream. Chinese officials answer that the dam will mostly run the river, not stop it, releasing water in a managed rhythm rather than holding it back, and that the silt problem is being studied with the same care as the power equations. You will have to judge that answer for yourself, because the honest truth is that nobody knows yet. The project is still in its earliest years, with tunnels and access roads being drilled into the mountain while the deepest chambers are still being designed. What can be said with confidence is this: the engineers who learned how to pour low-heat concrete in the Baihetan Canyon, who welded a 1,000,000-kilowatt unit to hair thickness tolerances, who built a transmission line that crosses rivers on towers taller than forests, are the same people now being sent up the Yarlung Zangbo. The canyon was their school. This gorge is the exam. And that is the pattern worth seeing, because it keeps repeating across the country, and it explains why these projects no longer seem to surprise anyone who watches closely. The Baihetan Dam was a school for the Megaproject. The Megaproject will be a school for whatever comes after, because the electricity it makes will have to travel even further, and the wires will have to get stronger again. Every frontier project in China trains the crews for the next frontier. The canyon is never the last canyon. There is always a steeper one upstream. So here is what the future looks like if the pattern holds. And it is not a fantasy, because every piece of it is already built or under construction somewhere. The western rivers, the last wild ones, get chained one by one into the grid. The transmission towers march further east, their voltage climbing again, until the power that lights the coastal cities is drawn from the roof of the world. The coal plants that still run on the eastern plains get retired a little earlier every year, because the river power is cheaper and the air is finally cleaning itself. And the engineers who built all of it retire to towns that have electricity they never think about, because thinking about it is their old job, and the machines are doing it now. If that sounds like a prediction, it is a soft one, and it carries a warning inside it. The same pattern that made the rivers powerful has also made them watched. Every kilometer of that new transmission line is a target if relations with neighbors ever sour. Every giant dam is a hostage to the weather and the ground. And the silt keeps settling. The fish keep losing their paths. The 100,000 moved families keep their memories of the drowned towns. History will weigh this country's rivers and decide whether the trade was worth it. The engineers who built Baihetan will not be the ones writing that verdict, but they are the ones who made the question possible, which is more than most generations can say. Come back to the control room one last time then, to the evening of the 20th of December 2022. The 16 panels are all glowing now. The last unit is turning. Outside the windows of the buried room, the canyon is dark and cold, and the new lake is still, a black sheet holding the reflected stars. Somewhere in the machine hall below, water that began its trip high in the mountains, as snow on rocks no one has ever named, is finishing its journey through steel, giving up its last strength to make a magnet spin. The lights of the control room hum. A supervisor fills in a logbook, closes it, and walks out into the night. He has done this 5,000 nights in a row. The river does not know his name. The dam does not need it. Behind him, the 16 panels will keep their steady green glow long after he is gone. The lake will keep its pressure. The coils will keep humming because that is what they were built for, and because somewhere far away, a city will keep asking for more. The magnets are turning, the wires are singing 2,000 kilometers away. The windows of a city are bright, and nobody in that city will ever think of the canyon. That is the whole point. The greatest machines are the ones that get forgotten the fastest, because they never ask for attention. They just hold the world up quietly, the way a river always has, and the way it always will, as long as there is somewhere to fall. If this channel has earned a little of your trust tonight, the one thing that keeps these deep dives alive is a subscription. And it is the smallest favor there is. No algorithms reward videos nobody asks for. When you subscribe, you're not just bookmarking a channel. You are telling the people who make the calls that the long stories matter, that someone is still listening after the first 3 minutes. And now the question that has been sitting in the corner of this whole story, the one I genuinely go back and forth on. If a river like the Jinsha could power 150 million people, and the price of that power was a drowned valley and 100,000 moved homes, would you call the trade fair? Or is there a line a country should not cross, no matter how many lights come on at the far end of the wire? Because that is the real test hiding inside every one of those glowing panels, and it is not a test of engineering. It is a test of what we think a river is for.